Good afternoon and welcome to D&I One-on-One. This is now a monthly series where we talk about different topics related to culture, inclusivity, diversity, belongingness, all those good culture-y things. And our conversation today is on ageism. And so that's what we're going to talk about. My name is Jina Etienne. I am creator and host of this series. I'm a certified diversity executive, and my work is centered on something that I call fearless inclusion. And I define that as the freedom to be yourself and the ability to create space for others to do the same. I develop trainings and workshops, as well as facilitate conversations and programs focused on helping participants connect mindfulness and self-awareness to daily actions and words. And ageism and talking about age and the language that sort of falls out of our mouth and the reaction that it has on us, that's part of why doing this work around self-awareness is so important, because we're trying to foster what I call, or what we call, psychological safety, which is where we can ask questions and show up and simply be who we are. And that's really how we're going to empower each other and create these really inclusive, dynamic, innovative, etc. workplaces. My guest today is Aricia Shaffer, or Ari. She's a master career strategist with Aricia Shaffer Coaching and Consulting. Whew, mouthful. She combines her educational background in psychology and communication with her experience as a psychotherapist to tackle career challenges, including the pervasive issue of ageism in the workplace. She's known for her innovative approach. She empowers clients to leverage their unique strengths and experiences to turn perceived obstacles, like age challenges, into assets. She offers her clients strategies to combat those age-related biases and stereotypes, and advocates for a workplace where the value of diversity, including diversity of age, is recognized alongside all of those other dimensions of diversity that we talk about. So Ari, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting, and thank you to everyone who's joining us.
So I want to start, when we went back to brainstorming today's session, like what were we going to talk about and what approach were we going to take, we very quickly landed on age and ageism. And there are a couple things that stood out to me. And in our conversation, you used some terms and some language and really talked about how we make these assumptions about people based on what we see. You had a story about your doctor and some terminology that your doctor used as an example. Do you mind sharing that story?
No, I'd be happy to. So I have a good relationship with my doctor. He's been my doctor for a while now, and we joke around. I went in with some sort of an issue like joint stiffness or something, and he said, it's sometimes, as people are approaching being, elderly, this can happen. And he used elderly again. And the second time that he said it, I gave him like the mom stare. And I was like, how would you feel if I called you Doogie? Because he is very young. And he said, I don't think that I'd like that. And it kind of led us to have a little bit of a discussion about age and ageism, and how it's not just about elderly people. It affects people of all ages. People might see my doctor and not want to work with him as their physician because he looks so young. So ageism really impacts all of us.
Should we tell everybody who Doogie is, just in case, so we're not making assumptions?
That. Speaking of an age thing, so there was a television show on in the 90s, 80s, and it was called Doogie Howser, MD. And it was about a very, very young doctor, I think graduated medical school at like 14 or something like that, and how people were really treating him badly because he was so young and they didn't think that he could do the work. I guess it's kind of like the show with Freddie Highmore now, where he plays an autistic young doctor and his experiences. That's another really good show that kind of features that intersectionality that happens.
So folks, we're not here to talk about television shows, but it's really interesting you say that, because there's so much of what we talk about in this work today that is actually, we're starting to see that diversity in commercials, in storylines, in characters, and that kind of thing. So let's start with, I always like to start with definitions. So I'm going to put this one up on the screen. And while I do that, Vaughn, can we totally do these polls out of order and go to the poll on age-related bias and interaction in the workplace?
Yes. So is that the is ageism an unconscious or conscious bias?
The third one.
Have you
Your
experienced
parents,
age? Yep,
yeah.
got you. I will do that. All right, I will put that up onto the screen right now. So yes, I've also given you a preview of a poll to come later. But yes, we have that first poll up on your screens now. Please go ahead and get those votes in. And you can go ahead and continue, and I'll give you the results in just a bit.
Excellent. Although she did give everybody the other question, they can start looking it up on Google. But ageism. Prejudice or discrimination against a particular age group, and especially the elderly. And I'm just curious if anybody's experienced ageism at work. You talked about language, and the thing that I remember you saying is that a word can signal frailty.
Mm-hmm.
And with that signaling comes presumptions about capabilities, their tech savviness. Is it time for them to retire? Should I dismiss the kinds of things that they say? So what jumps out to you in terms of some of that language, and why using that language and the assumptions we make about it matter?
Well, I think that age and looking at different generations kind of flags a lot of things for us. Just like the young doctor, people assume, he can't know what he's talking about. He doesn't have that much experience. And even the flip side of it, he must be so smart that he can't really relate to patients, that he has a terrible bedside manner, whatever it is. And that's true across all of the different ages, just like you talked about with frailty. For example, somebody might look at the example I use is somebody might look at somebody who's older in a wheelchair and think, oh, they have a degenerative disease, or they lost their balance, or they broke a hip or something like that. And they look at somebody younger in a wheelchair and they, with a broken leg or something, and they may think, oh, they broke their leg skiing.
Right.
Capability to somebody who's younger than somebody who's older, and just making that assumption.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the poll, is the poll still open?
I have it open, but I was just about to close it. I think you can see the results, but I can also share them with you as well.
I can. And so folks, I'm thanking you in advance for your patience, because I'm still getting used to the platform. I'm looking all over the place. It's like a dashboard. And I see almost half the people said, yes, they've experienced an age-related bias or interaction at work. So are you surprised at that result? 45% actually said yes. So I think there's some lagging with your video, Ari. But I don't know if you heard that question. Are you surprised to hear that?
I'm not, because I talk with my kids about this and their experiences too. And my son was one of those kind of advanced learner types of people. And he really wanted to volunteer at a museum that's right down the street from us, the Butterfly Museum, because he wanted to go into marine science. And they had a lot of displays with all kinds of animal creatures that were water creatures. So he really wanted to volunteer there, and they wouldn't take him until I said, can you just interview him? And then if you don't want to, that's fine. And they talked with him and they're like, yeah, this is great. So, it's 12-year-olds, it's teenagers. I find teenagers to be incredibly maligned by society. It's millennials, with people having these assumptions about the avocado toast and the selfishness and the entitlement. And I know a lot of millennials that are not that way at all. So those assumptions can really trip us up.
There's a famous quote, and anybody who's been listening on any of my webinars, I probably bring this more often than I realize. But there is a TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie. Please tell me I said her name right. And it's called The Danger of a Single Story. And one of the things she says in there, first time I heard it, she said, the problem with stereotypes isn't that they are untrue, but that they're incomplete. And I think what you're talking about there speaks to that. In fact, I'm going to jump to this slide with Betty White and Jodie Foster, because this is an example of an assumption that we make. And it's not wrong. It's just there's a whole lot more to it than that. You want to talk about why you like these pictures?
Yeah, as I was getting this ready, I thought I would reference Golden Girls, and then I thought, will they know what Golden Girls it was all about? Because that was a great show. I think it'd be good for people to check into it. But Betty White, this is her at 60 years old, and she looks like a grandma that would bake cookies.
Very typical, yeah.
Right, exactly. And the roles that she got were often in that matriarch kind of place. On Golden Girls, she played a widow who was really worried that her pension was running out. She couldn't get hired because of ageism, and they didn't think that she would have the energy to do the job. Then you take a look at Jodie Foster, who's 61, and one of her most recent roles was it called Naya? I can't remember exactly the name of the show. Was it? And she plays a open ocean swim coach, and she is just buff and energetic and getting stuff done. So, and also when we look at this, we might think, Betty White is kind of, slowing down and declining in this picture. When she was on the Golden Girls, she did that series for years and years and years. But after that, she went on to work another 40 years doing series, doing television shows, movies, voiceovers. So we really can't judge a book by its cover, so to speak.
And I think what I thought was really interesting about you wanting to bring this up is that when we see somebody like Betty White, when we see that image, we think, we think mature.
Mm-hmm.
And yet today, if nobody gave me their ages and nobody said anything, and you said age 60,
mm-hmm.
Jodie Foster would never pop into my mind because of the stereotypes and the expectations of women at certain ages. I mean, there's a whole conversation we can have about gender norms and societal roles and expectations. But some of the ageism challenges that we have, women are disproportionately impacted by those because there's an intersection of expectations that affect women.
Absolutely. And it's really a lot of the gender roles and things like that too. It's like when I look at a picture of myself at nearly 60 and what my mom looked like when she was 60, you can really see all of those cultural expectations that were put on her to look a certain way and to act a certain way.
Yeah. And actually, I wanted to put this slide up because that's exactly what we're talking about, those misconceptions that I'm making assumptions about my generation because I'm in it.
Mm-hmm.
And for the period of when I'm growing up, there were messages around boomers. There are constantly messages. A lot of us are hearing about millennials.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a Gen X. I'm between. So millennial is Gen Y or millennial. Those are interchangeable terms. So I'm Gen X. And I think that there are these stereotypes that I carry about my own generation and about other generations. And those stereotypes are rooted in my experience growing up.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. Yeah. And it kind of goes back to those cultural expectations of people. And, when we look at, this is how people are viewed from my generation, we start to see those traits within ourselves, even if that's not really the truth. We can pick out pieces. Like if I'm looking at all of the different generations and somebody said, without telling me which one it was, people in your generation tend to be like this. There are truths in my life that I could see about each of those generations.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, if I look at, for example, my work ethic, I tend to fall more into the silent generation. Those are people, as we talked about a little bit earlier, that are like in their 80s. And they tend to be people that, their boss tells them, this is what I need. And they're like, all right, let's make that happen. And that's how I tend to work. In the boomer kind of field, when we talk about technology and struggling with technology, it takes me a lot longer to learn that kind of stuff than I think other people do. So that's a truth there. Gen X, kind of being the, I don't know. I always think of the silent generation when I think of Gen X, because they're kind of discounted.
We're the invisible generation.
The invisible generation, right. And so I can see those traits in myself, but I can see millennial things in myself too. I can see Gen Z. I can even see some of the alpha stuff with, getting really acquainted with AI. So, we're all in the same boat, and we can learn from each other's strengths, and we can help each other with each other's weaknesses. But it's not that we can just discount an entire generation because, they're entitled, or they're not tech savvy, or they're old, or whatever it is.
So I'm curious. I'm going to go ahead. I don't know if we're earlier or on schedule, but I want to go ahead and pop this up there because we've been talking about generations. So I'm curious, for everyone out there, what you think. Who has the biggest problem here? Because there are assumptions we're going to make about all the generations. But the question is, which one has it the worst? Now, let me see if I can find it. Okay. So the responses are coming in. The question is, if we had to identify the generation that has the biggest problem with ageism, which generation would that be? So boomers, by the way, so folks know, we didn't put the silent generation up here. Boomers today are somewhere between the ages of 60 and 78. Gen X, somewhere between the age of 44 and 59. Gen Y, or millennials, between 28 and 43. So yes, you heard me right. They're in their early 40s. Gen Z, 12 to 27. And then if you're 11 years or younger, you're Gen Alpha. Give or take a year, depending on who you talk about, where you get your source. But those age bands are generally the case.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. Let me know. How do I know the poll is open or closed, Vaughn?
I still have it open, so it's on that open tab, but you can see the responses. We've got the majority of the audience responded. It looks like all of the above at 54%, but then out of the other ones, Boomer is the one that got 24%.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. And by the same token, Gen X, 7%, Gen Z, 5%. But for the most part, most people said all of the above. So what's the right answer?
Well, it's interesting how people answer this, because oftentimes they are acutely aware of the biases against them for the age generation that they're in, right? And so I am going to be more acutely aware of biases against Gen X and the boomers, because I'm like on the cusp. Yeah. And so I'll see that. At the same time, I tend to be able to see a lot of different perspectives. And so I get it when people talk about boomers being a certain way or Gen Z being a certain way. I understand where those stereotypes come from. But it's, again, it's more about looking at that generation or that age of person and saying, what is it that they have to offer? What is it? How can we could collaborate together?
Right. It's fascinating. So one of the things that I picked as a picture was some of those things that you're talking about, which is the assumptions I make based on the generation I'm in. And I remember when I showed you this picture, I don't remember if we had the same reaction to it, although I know we're very close in age. But when I saw this picture, and what I would invite the participants looking at it, I'm going to go to the Q&A because I know that's where people drop their comments in. Which one of these persons, if this was a scene at the end of a meeting where somebody just got a job offer and then accepted the job offer and they're reaching across and say, welcome, you're so glad to have you. And the other, who's the person that's extended the job offer? Is it the gentleman on the left, the younger gentleman, and the person of color? Or is the person who got the job offer the gentleman on the right older, looks white, but actually could be Latino or Hispanic. So I'd be curious, drop your comments in the chat. But this was another part of this conversation you're talking about where your doctor looked at you and said elderly.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this slide. You know, and it really speaks to kind of our own experiences, because as you and I were looking at it and talking about it, I said, for me, I feel like the older gentleman is the one who's being hired, because that's the age group that I often work with, are people in their 40s, 50s, 60s. And age discrimination at work starts at 40. Like you could wind up losing a job or not getting a job offer if you're 41 years old. That blows my mind.
Or getting transitioned out.
Yes.
As you get older because of assumptions around agility, modernization, understanding technology, understanding our customer base, depending on the industry that you're in. By the way, I'm looking at the comments coming in, and most people seem to be saying the person on the right is the one getting the job offer. Some people are saying the person on the left. And the funniest answer that I got that it came in so far was that the person on the right was getting the job offer because he has the crappier chair. So I was like, okay, there is an astute observation. The gentleman on the left has the nice chair. He must work there. So
that's great. That's great. Yeah, I like the one that said neither one of them are dressed appropriately for an interview.
Hey, modern times. Actually, some of what we're talking about when you think about dress codes in the office, when I started working in a big 8 accounting firm back in the late 80s, and women could not wear pants. I was explicitly told the first day I walked in with pants, a woman pulled me into her office and said, yeah, we can't do that. You have to wear a skirt or a dress. Wow. So there are all of these unwritten rules, and the workforce expectations are changing, partly because of demographic changes. I mean, that's what happened as boomers at some point were in their 20s and 30s, right? The term boomer comes from the generation where post World War, was it II, World War I, World War II, where people were having a lot of children. So there was this boom, if you will, in the population, baby boomers.
Right.
Where that comes from. I'm sure that's the one I know off the top of my head the most. That question actually came in, I saw on the Q&A. I forgot where I was going with that.
Well, you know, I wanted to make a comment too, because there's some historical interesting bits to this. When I work with people and I talk with them and they're saying, you know, I want to retire in X amount of years. You know, retirement has always been around, but it was really the baby boomers growing up and needing to get jobs that pushed the silent generation out. They did not mostly want to retire. Most of them wanted to stay at their jobs. And what we find, at least what I find as a coach, when I'm working with people that retire, a lot of times they call me back and they're like, you know what? I hate it. I hate being retired. I need to find kind of my third act. And do that, because I have probably another 30 or 40 years, and I need to be doing something meaningful that I love, and I want to feel productive.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because the very word retirement, when you say retirement, and I just acknowledged it to myself, I was thinking about this as you said it. Retirement means I'm older. By definition, if I'm retiring, there's this assumption or presumption, stereotype, if you will. That means I'm in my early to mid 60s, possibly older. Some of that might be because of that's when people are entitled to retirement benefits. You know, the word itself has some other meaning to it, compliance related. But if somebody retires and they visually seem to be young, or we know they're young, they're in their 20s and they retire, I'm going to make all kinds of assumptions about them.
Sure.
Like the Doogie Howser thing that you were talking about earlier, they must be, okay, so here my biases, I'm going to show you all of them. If somebody retired in their 20s and they're young, I'm thinking tech, millionaire.
Right.
Those are the first two things that come to mind,
Sure.
which may or may not be true. I'm
Mhm.
making a bunch of assumptions about somebody based solely on age, not age alone. Yes, but when you layer in some other context, all of a sudden, I start making some very sophisticated and complex, sometimes nuanced assumptions about somebody.
Mhm.
I wanted
Yep.
to put this slide up here just so everybody, if you've downloaded the handout, I just wanted to point this because you mentioned intersectionality before, and that's what I'm talking about. All of these different layers. I just added the gentleman, the gender, the age, the industry, and made a whole bunch of assumptions about that.
Mhm. Right, right. Yeah, and what we find happens is, let's say somebody is older and they have hearing loss.
Mhm.
Okay? Somebody younger with hearing loss is not going to face the same biases. And somebody who's older that doesn't have hearing loss is going to face different biases. But what happens is, if somebody is older and they have some other thing going on, whatever that is, like a disability, a gender, people of color, gay, lesbian, bisexual, all of that, it is a strange vortex that happens that makes the bias against them stronger than either of those independently. So it's like the bias grows exponentially, and they really struggle.
Yeah, I think that's why it's important to understand the concept of intersectionality, because so much when the work we hear in the general umbrella of diversity and inclusion tends to create these very linear or highly organized groups. So we speak to women,
Mhm.
we speak to people with disabilities,
Right.
we speak to people in the LGBTQ plus community, and then we talk about gender, but what we don't include in the gender conversation are people who are cisgender.
Mhm.
But we never look at how all of these things together and then the assumptions that makes. So I love Vortex. I'm totally stealing that. I want us to flip, if we can, to this conversation about microaggressions, and in
Sure.
particularly, I think we're talking about a lot of interesting concepts. We're talking about high level principles, but this is where the rubber hits the road. Rubber
Mhm.
meets the road. Uh, so, what is a microaggression? A microaggression is essentially something that's usually subtle, often unintended, and it's a remark that is received by the other person as hostile, hurtful, a feeling of marginalization, dismissal. And the word micro, this first bullet down here, just because it's micro, it's teeny weeny, it was subtle, it was a joke, it was intended to be funny,
Mhm.
it can still have really long lasting effects. And I
Mhm.
did put this one example up here. So I'll just read it out loud, although you're not supposed to read your slides. During a meeting to troubleshoot something in software that's new, Alan, who's Gen Z, so I'm going to say Alan is 28, 27, says to Jay, who is 60, "Oh, you won't understand this technology. It's too advanced for your generation." Ha 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 ha. But that really, first of all, Alan, your biases are showing. The stereotype assumptions you're making are wrong, and it's unfair to Jay. How do people in the workplace, if you're with your clients, and what do we do here? What happens when somebody comes to you and says, "I'm tired because I don't want to put up with this anymore"? I don't know that they have, but what do you say to that?
With microaggressions,
Or just
um,
being dismissed because age comes up and it immediately puts me in a box, and I'm struggling now to get out of that box without feeling
right.
defensive, or, like I have to do something to get out of the box, and it's not a good thing.
Well, we talk about microaggressions, and as you and I were talking before the show, something that I call sympathetic dismissiveness, where people are like, oh, can I reach that for you? Can I help you? Let me get that door. And it's like, I mean, you're being nice, why would somebody have a problem with you being nice? It's because you're assuming that they can't do that thing, whatever it is. And so that's kind of the other side of microaggression that is equally as disabling for people. But how do you handle microaggressions? The saying that I like, it's from Buddhism, but they talk about how the words that come out of our mouth are pebbles, but when they land, they can feel like boulders. And that's something to keep in mind. I was going to go down a different rabbit hole, but basically, when we do things to somebody else, it doesn't feel terrible to us usually. I mean, usually it's like, oh, it was just a joke, or I'm kidding, whatever.
Everybody knows ...
Right, exactly. But to that other person, it can really impact them, and it can shut them down so they're not participating as much. And so that they are starting to think of themselves differently even, which is just terribly damaging. So, so what do you do? I mean, I always start with communication. It's like there has to be a conversation that happens. And I typically, if it's possible, suggest pulling that person aside and saying, hey, do you have a minute? Can we talk about this? And kind of like what I did with the doctor, where I'm like, I'm sure you can put yourself in my shoes, and understand that just does not feel good. And, and I want to learn about technology. Let's find a way. Maybe we can mentor each other. I can teach you about this thing. You can teach me about that thing. And it kind of builds that relationship. I was just talking with a friend of mine yesterday, and I love what he says about any time that he has a conflict with anybody, he will, go someplace private with them so that they're not like in front of everybody. And he will say, look, I'm here to help and you're here to help. So, let's figure this out together. I love that. I mean, it's so simple. It's such a simple tool, but, so often when a microaggression is put out there, there's kind of this defensiveness that happens. And then there's a defensiveness on the other side. It was just a joke,
Yeah. Well, but I think so I'm actually preparing for a webinar I'm doing next week. And one of the things that I was reading through some research today about verbal and nonverbal communication, and that most of our communication is nonverbal. And in the workplace, those signals are very, very real. And I can very quickly lose confidence if I get a dismissive comment, and I assume then one person says it, so then I start to feel like self-conscious or conspicuous, and maybe everybody thinks this. And now, because everybody thinks this, I'm going to do one of two things: possibly withdraw,
right,
or overcompensate. And in neither situation am I bringing my best to work. In both of those situations now, if you imagine that I have 100 energy units to bring to work every day, I'm burning 30 of them to overcompensate.
Right.
Or 30 of them to actively hide and hold back and cover things up, which means I only got 70 to give.
Right.
And I think that this happens regardless. I do worry, though, in terms of ageism, we have conversations about gender bias and race and all these other categories we were talking about. We don't talk about ageism.
Not really.
I mean, it's a safe bias to have, but that's very dangerous.
Right. I mean, ageism. Another one is fat phobia, that we don't, talk about, and another one is the mental health stuff. Those are three big ones. So
there's a big,
since we're talking with people.
Vaughn, are you experiencing the lagging that I'm experiencing?
A little bit. I think it'll pop back in just a minute.
Yeah. And I can't tell if she's frozen. So while we wait for her to come back in, I want to pop over to this slide because part of what we're talking about in these interactions are these unwritten rules and these group dynamics. When I was saying I might cover or hold back, these are the kinds of things that we might start to see. And one of the challenges in organizations is that we sometimes have situations where an entire group, an entire layer of leadership is in the same generation. So for example, it wouldn't be surprising to find out that in a CBA firm, most of the partners are boomers, maybe with some older Gen Xers. Most of the managers or the senior managers might be Gen Xers. And then many of the maybe emerging leaders might be millennial or in the older end of the millennial spectrum. So what happens there then is you end up with a risk of homogeneity, if you will. So we have a homogenous leadership group, regardless of gender and all of those other differences. They're all around the same age. And as a result of that, you might see some of these things happening in terms of group dynamics. You might see the one person, that younger person in the meeting feels like they're being dismissed. They feel pressure to just agree, or they choose to not challenge an idea or bring it up. I have an idea, like they choose not to bring it up because there's a risk that they're going to be dismissed, just like in that microaggression, or you wouldn't understand, you're too young. Well, this is how we used to do it. This is how we've always done it. These are the words that we start to hear that cue that there's some challenges around age and assumptions people are making around age. And as a result of those assumptions, you've either lost opportunities, really opportunities, as well as, I don't want to say respect, but a certain type of trust, that there are only areas that you might be able to engage because other areas you just don't have permission to be part of those conversations. So while we're waiting for Ari to come back, go ahead and drop into the Q&A. I'm curious to see what people say. When you see these pictures, what comes to mind? And I will tell you, when I was looking for these pictures, that is the typewriter I learned to type in. It is an IBM Selectric 2 for the record. And I learned to type in a high school typing class. So it's just really interesting. I know that it'll take a moment for the questions, answers to start popping in here. 301, 301. Sorry, folks. I need to see how my... okay. I'm looking at this wrong. So somebody says 80s, old school, my grandparents, boomer. Great question, Mitra. How do I flag that to Mark's priority? There, I'll see that. 1975. All right, next one. Somebody said, is boomer a derogatory term? That is a great question. While I ask you all to drop in what generation these pictures come from, is boomer a derogatory term? I worry that we're getting to be too sensitive about language, and rightly so around some terms. I think boomer, we use it to specifically speak to a generation, where it becomes an age band, if you will. Where it can become offensive is when you're using it as a adjective about a specific person rather than speaking to a group in the population, for example. It's like saying elderly. It's okay to say elderly when you're talking about age groups in a particular context. Let's say people in a certain life stage from a medical perspective. All right, so let's see what people are saying about this one. The 80s, let's see, Gen X, BlackBerry and cassettes are not in the same year. That is true, but they all preceded the iPhone 92 or whichever version we're up to these days. I have no idea. And then this last picture, just for fun, this generation. By the way, did you all see the Boston Dynamics new robot that picks itself up off of the floor yoga style? Fascinating. But I see people wearing these headphones or some brand of headphone like this. Ari was talking about avocado toast, which I thought was funny. But the other thing you could think about is the Starbucks generation. I mean, the idea of going to a fancy coffee shop, if you will, even in my early 40s, was not like today. We think nothing of running to Starbucks. And for many of us who are older, that is something we've eventually came to do versus someone who's younger might just have always gone to Starbucks because, for example, when my kids were younger, I can see stopping by a Starbucks on the way to taking them to elementary school. For them, it's part of the routine. So I see here, what comes to mind, somebody said everybody but boomers. That was an interesting one. Those are 2010 Beat headphones. All right, the fact that somebody might know that is a little scary, but that just goes to show you how some of us are tuned in a little bit more than others. All right, let's go ahead and launch that third polling question, if we will. Is ageism an unconscious or conscious bias poll? Where is that?
Oh, there we go. Yes, it is on your screens now. So it is open.
And I now know where to find them. Thank you. So I can see
Perfect.
it. I tell you what, Vaughn, give me 25 more webinars on this platform and I'll know how it works.
Will do.
Oh, there you go. All right. While that is open, let me take a peek at some of the Q&A here. Oh, somebody asked where did the terms come from? So I touched a little bit on that. Somebody just made the comment, beware of a company's reorganization, in air quotes. Seen many middle-aged people reorganized out of a company. So that is a fair thing that we've seen happen, that they change job descriptions or they eliminate positions and roles. And what they might really be doing is moving people out who are older. Now, I'd be curious, the term middle-aged just popped in there and it got me thinking, when we say middle-aged, what does that mean? Somebody asked about boomer being derogatory. How can you be proactive and indirectly address your age in a job interview? One of the things that I used to do, because when I was young, I looked really young and I was self-conscious of it, I would speak specifically to my experiences in a way that would signal, not my age, but it would signal to people what type of experience I had. Just like saying I started in the Big 8, instead of saying in a large accounting firm, that will anchor me in a certain time period and signal to people how much experience I might have without having to say, hey, I've worked in this industry for X number of years. So that's kind of something that you can think about. All right, let me go back to that poll. Let me see where we are. It's open still. Welcome back, Ari. We have launched the poll, and is ageism an unconscious or conscious bias? And I see here 45%, it's still open, I think. 45% said, no, wait, 10%. Oh, Lord.
No problem. The majority of the audience said both. How about that? 72%.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, people, I am a CPA and I cannot read these numbers. So 72% got it right. It is both an unconscious and a conscious bias. And by the term unconscious simply means we are operating on all of those messages and beliefs and assumptions that have become the way we think, and not just we individually. It's not a bad thing. It's just the way our brains shortcut our thinking. We see data, we see cues, we see something, and our brains go, yep, got it, know what that is, and off we go. Age is one of those cues that will drive some of our behavior. So it's unconscious, but it's also conscious for the very reasons that the examples Ari was giving earlier. Somebody's in a wheelchair and they're older, so I will now consciously change the things that I say, maybe jokes that I make at happy hour, or the offer, hey, can I get that door for you? So that is the kind of thing that actively will change. Our biases are both things that we're operating on autopilot, as I call it, or things that I'm doing, usually well-meaning. So there you go. That's the answer to that question. All right, where are we on time? We have about 8 or 9 minutes left.
I made it back.
Hear your voice?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I guess your camera's off.
I turned the camera off just because of the stability. So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So now I just get to see myself. That's kind of terrifying. Maybe I should turn my camera off.
Oh, they can look at the picture. There's my picture. So we're all set.
All right, look. But now you can just see a big giant J. All right, that is bizarre.
Actually, that's just for our view. The attendees just see the slides. We're good.
Again,
there we go.
learning
Oh,
new
awesome.
platform, everyone. Thank you so much. All right. So Ari, you are back. And
Yeah. And when I dropped off, it took me a minute to get back, but what I was saying is, have you done the 4 agreements slide yet?
no, let me put that up.
So this is one of those things. It's kind of small, but I know that you have it in your handouts. And it's something that I really like when we're talking about communicating, whether it's at work or at home. There are 4 rules that the author of the 4 agreements came up with that I feel like are just so wonderful for communication. And the first is to be impeccable with your word. And a lot of these, I feel like I could just go really deep with them and I could do like an entire workshop on each one of these, but they give you a lot to think about. The second one is don't take things personally. And I find that helps a lot when I'm talking with people. Of course, there should not be any microaggressions towards you. And that needs to be dealt with. But when we take it in and we tell ourselves stories about it, it has an even deeper impact on us. So if there's any way that we can say, you know what, this is about them, not about me, I need to have a conversation with them.
Let me jump in there real quick.
Yeah.
And share. There are a bunch of safe space rules that we can invoke if we're going to walk into an uncomfortable conversation or talk about a sensitive topic. Because when you pull that person aside the way you were describing, that's so much easier said than done. And for some of us more than others. And so when you think about don't take things personally, it also goes with, don't make assumptions. What you might want to think about, or maybe say out loud with the other person before you start this conversation, one of the rules might be honor the hurt or the impact and assume good intent. So we say here, don't make assumptions, but if you and I, Ari, are going to have an uncomfortable conversation, I want to talk with you after something I heard earlier.
Right.
I'm going to assume you didn't mean anything by that. You didn't mean to be hurtful, that you had good intentions.
Exactly.
And what you would do is acknowledge that it probably landed on me a little differently. And that puts us in a place where we can start to have a constructive dialogue and then practice these 4 agreements.
Yes, exactly. And it really is, it's that intention versus perception, just like we were talking about with the pebble and the boulder. It's like my intention may be completely different than the way that my words are perceived by the other person. And, I need to just accept that. I can't say, well, you're wrong to feel that way. They feel the way that they feel. Right. And making me aware of it, they're being very vulnerable by coming to me and saying, I just wanted to make you aware of this. This was something that hurt my feelings. That's an incredibly vulnerable place to be in. And they're trusting you. Mm-hmm. They're not attacking you. They're really trusting you by saying something. And of course, the third one is don't make assumptions, which we just kind of talked about. And then always do your best. And that doesn't mean always going above and beyond and always being at 150%, because sometimes our best is much less than it is on other days. So it depends on how many energy units we have, as you were saying. And some days we've got 50 energy units and other days 200.
Yeah. Be where you are and do what you can. Don't fake it.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Let me think. I'm looking at some of the Q&A and I'm looking at the time. I think, so there are some suggestions that you wanted to include around what can people do then? What are some actionable takeaways? And so one of the things we talked about is mentoring. I wanted to make sure that I put this in here so that folks go back and look at this list. I think that this list is really sort of the pros and the cons of mentoring, and that mentoring goes both ways. That's the 4th bullet here. But you also had something that I thought caught my eye, or maybe it was my ear, didactic encounter cards, and then the questions, which we have a slide on. Can you talk about those 2 really quick?
Yeah. So these are any of the cards that you're going to find. And if you look them up online and you go on Facebook, you'll find a million more, because they'll send you all the advertisements for them. But they're basically cards that go through and just ask questions, like, where did you grow up? Or what's your favorite animal? Or what was the biggest, what was your favorite teacher? All of these kinds of things that just allow conversations to start and for you to get to know each other. What we find is that when people know each other, they're much less likely to do those little microaggression zingers, as I call them. So yeah, so that's what those cards are about. You can just put a few of them on the lunch tables, and just kind of starts a conversation.
And then the 3 questions. What was that? Well, tell us a little bit more about the 3 questions.
Yeah, well, and I kind of also wanted to say the quote by Albert Einstein, because I just feel like that's such a great quote. We don't need to go. Well, okay. Oh my goodness, there's the slide. Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it's stupid. And that's what happens to us with ageism as well. When we're like, our generation is pretty smart, but those boomers, boy, they just they don't understand technology at all. Or those millennials, they'll never be, empathetic with other people. And we say these things because we're so separated by generation, and we need to have more communication with one another. So one of the things I talk about is the 3 questions. So you can put that slide back up. And these are great questions to ask one another. Like if you do a mentoring kind of relationship with somebody at work, and this needs to be set up randomly. If you want to do by age, it would be, mixing a boomer with a Gen Xer or that kind of thing. And a good place to start is asking these questions. What do you wonder about? What's your why? And how do you want to be seen? Those are just like, they're really deep questions, but they allow people to be as vulnerable as they want to be. And it's a good place to start a mentorship relationship, or even just, communicating with other people at work.
Yeah, activating an open dialogue.
Right.
What I also find interesting is that when we have prescribed questions, it's not as if I'm just coming up to you and saying, well, what do you wonder about? And it can be taken the wrong way. So I do think that having something like this neutralizes the questions in a way that they are safe to answer, to your point about people can be as vulnerable as they feel comfortable being.
Exactly.
All right. Well, we are maybe at the 3-minute mark before we have to wrap up. And there are 2 questions in here that I just wanted to touch on real quickly. That's okay. One of them is, what are some positive uses for the different generational labels? And I'll share my thought, and then maybe you can share yours. We can do this 30 seconds each. I think maybe we just avoid the labels altogether, and we tap into different people's experiences and backgrounds. Some of those differences of experience and background will have to do with how long they've lived, how long they've worked in a particular job or held a particular role, or that kind of thing. Implied in that might be age, but we're not doing it because I'm in an XYZ generation. So how about we don't use the labels at all? So that's my thought. What about you, Ari?
Yeah, I mean, I think that labels sometimes give us a little bit of a handle, but what we have to be sure of is that we're understanding the individual. So we could maybe look at somebody and say, oh, that's an older worker. I bet that they know how this or that works. Check that out. Go and talk to them and say, hey, I'm new here and I'm wondering if you can help me with this particular thing. They may say, you know what, I was just hired 2 days ago too. I don't know. But that's why it's important to check those things out. It's okay that we have, these assumptions in our head. That's like the way our brain works in the world to survive, is putting things into categories.
Yeah.
We just have to confirm that and approach each other really from a place of curiosity rather than judgment.
Well, let's go ahead and open up that last poll. And while that poll is open, there is one other question that we haven't somehow worked into this. And they ask, what is the proper way to help a disabled person? Ask if they need help before assuming that they do. Yes, There's your answer. We don't want to assume anything about anyone. There's a story I heard, a woman who was walking. I think she had a broken foot. She was walking with a boot. She had a cane. She gets to a door and she's about to open a building, and somebody from the inside comes out and pushes the door open, thinking they're being helpful, not realizing she was going to use that door for leverage in the way she was shifting her weight, and she fell.
Oh.
And so instead of somebody asking if they needed help with the door, they just did it. Mm-hmm. This wasn't about being having a disability, although in that case, she did have some challenges with her mobility. But just don't assume.
Right.
Your thoughts? Anything to add there?
No, I think just, I would encourage people to read the 4 agreements. I just find that it is such an incredible tool for communication.
Agreed. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I loved having this conversation. We could have gone on and on and on this topic because it's such an important topic.
It is indeed. And, I encourage people to reach out too. If they want to continue the conversation, feel free to reach out, and I'd love to talk with you.
Our contact information is on our slides in the handout. So you're welcome to reach out anytime, especially where you can find us on LinkedIn. And with that, thank you everyone for joining us. Ari, thank you for being with me today. And Vaughn, back to you to close us out.